Sometimes you hear a number that just makes you stop and think. Like this one. Iran, right, facing tons of U.S. sanctions, still managed to pull in over $50 billion from oil exports.
$50 billion each year in 2022 and 2023.
Exactly. With all those sanctions, it's kind of mind-boggling. So the big question is how? How are they actually managing that?
It really is the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer takes us into this really shadowy, complex world. Today, we're going to dive deep into how Iran gets around these sanctions and also what the U.S. is doing or trying to do about it.
Okay.
And we pulled from quite a few places for this India Today. The Indian Express, Economic Times, Flash 24/7, Commandalist, Business Standard, The Print, and crucially, info straight from the U.S. Treasury's OFAC.
OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control.
Right. Yeah, them. They're the ones enforcing these sanctions.
So basically, this is your shortcut to understanding a really complex piece of global trade and, well, politics. We'll unpack the methods, some pretty clever, some pretty brazen, that are used to bypass these rules.
Trying to give you that clear picture without you needing a PhD in maritime law.
Exactly. Get you up to speed on this pretty fascinating situation. Okay, let's get into it. This term keeps coming up, the shadow fleet. What exactly are we talking about?
Right, the shadow fleet. It's essentially this whole network. You've got the oil tankers, obviously, but also the brokers, the shipping companies, all allegedly operating, deceptively.
Under false pretenses.
Yeah, using tricky tactics to move sanctioned stuff. In this case, we're mainly focused on Iranian oil, petroleum products.
Okay.
But it's important to say this isn't just about Iran. You hear shadow fleet when people talk about Russian oil too, or Venezuelan crude. Anywhere there are heavy sanctions, really.
So it's like this hidden logistics system operating outside the normal rules. What's the main goal? Just avoiding sanctions.
That's the core of it, yeah. Directly countering economic sanctions by operating in this, let's call it a legal gray area. They want to make it super difficult to track what they're doing, keep their movements hidden, and crucially, hide where that oil actually came from.
Makes sense. Harder to track, harder to stop. So what kinds of tactics are they using? How do they stay in the shadows?
Well, there are several common ones. Probably the best known is switching off their AIS.
The automatic identification system?
Exactly. It's meant for safety, broadcast the ship's location, identity, but they just turn it off, go dark. These are often called dark activities.
Right. No signal, no dot on the map. What else?
Then there's messing with their navigation data. GNSS manipulation.
Like spoofing their GPS.
Pretty much, yeah. Making it look like the ship is somewhere it's not. And flag hopping.
Flag hopping.
Yeah. Constantly changing the country the ship is registered under.
Right.
Switching between Panama, Liberia, Tanzania, maybe others. It helps dodge specific rules tied to one country's flag. We've seen reports of Iranian ships doing this quite a bit.
Like changing disguises constantly. Are there other ways they hide?
Oh, absolutely. Ownership structures. They often use really complicated, deliberately unclear ownership setups.
To hide who actually owns the ship.
Exactly. Hide the owners, hide the ship's origins. These kind of weak ownership structures, as they're sometimes called, make it really tough for authorities to figure out who's really behind it all.
Layers upon layers of confusion, it sounds like. What about the oil itself? How do they hide that?
That's where ship-to-ship transfers come in STS transfers. They often do these way out at sea, outside normal port areas.
Why out there?
To disguise the oil's origin. They transfer the Iranian oil onto a non-sanctioned vessel, often using smaller tankers, like handy-sized tankers.
Handy-sized, those are the smaller ones, right?
Yeah, typically carry maybe 10,000 to 40,000 tons. Good for regional stuff. They might load from a bigger shadow fleet tanker, or even sometimes from smaller commercial or fishing boats that smuggle the oil out initially.
Wow. How long does that take?
These STS transfers can take days, actually, especially if they're filling up a larger tanker from multiple smaller ones.
Days. Just floating out there, swapping oil. Sounds risky. Okay, so the oil's on a new ship. What then? How do they hide its past?
Right, so after the transfer, the next step is often blending. They mix the Iranian oil with products from other countries.
Oh, okay. Dilute the evidence.
Sort of. And then they create fake shipping documents, falsify everything to remove any link back to Iran.
Completely new identity for the cargo.
Yep. And then that oil, now seemingly legitimate, maybe claimed to be Iraqi oil or something, can be loaded onto regular tankers and sold on the international market.
Man, it's like a spy novel plot. Hidden ships, fake locations, changing flags, shell companies, secret transfers, blending, forged papers. just with giant tankers.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned a recent U.S. crackdown.
Yes. April 10th, 2025, the U.S. announced new sanctions. And what's really striking is this was the fifth round targeting Iranian oil sales in less than 3 months.
Fifth round. Wow, so they're really turning up the heat.
It definitely shows this ongoing maximum pressure campaign against Iran is still very much active. Remember, that policy really ramped up under the Trump administration, and it seems to be continuing.
And this latest round, it zeroed in on someone specific, right? An individual.
It did, yeah. The main focus was an Indian national based in the UAE named Jugwinder Singh Brar.
Jugwinder Singh Brar. Okay. What's his role alleged to be?
He's described as a ship captain, but also an owner and director of 2 UAE-based companies, Prime Tankers LLC and Glory International FZ LLC.
So the U.S. is saying he's a key player in the shadow fleet.
That's the allegation. OFAC, the Treasury Department arm, says Brar owns multiple shipping firms controlling nearly 30 vessels, and they claim many of these ships are part of Iran's shadow fleet.
30 vessels? That's quite a fleet. And it wasn't just him targeted, his companies too.
Correct. Brar himself, plus 4 companies linked to him, 2 in India. Global Tankers Private Limited in Chandigarh said to own or manage ships in his fleet, and BMP Solutions Private Limited, also Chandigarh-based, a petrochemical sales firm with branches near major Indian ports.
And they share an address?
Apparently, yes. Same registered address. Then the 2 UAE firms we mentioned, Prime Tankers and Glory International, they're said to own, operate, or manage almost 30 tankers, mostly those handy-sized ones.
Okay, so Treasury is painting a picture of a whole network. What are the specific things they accuse Brar and these companies of doing?
It's quite a list. First, owning and running ships that transported Iranian oil for NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company, and even for the Iranian military.
NIOC, the state oil company.
Yeah. Second, they allege his ships were involved in high-risk STS transfers of Iranian oil in waters off Iraq, Iran, the UAE, the Gulf of Oman. Key transit areas.
High risk legally, but I imagine physically dangerous too, doing that secretly.
Absolutely. Operating covertly in busy or monitored waters is inherently risky. Third, they accuse Brar of coordinating with, let me get the phrasing right, illicit shipping associates of a guy named Saeed al-Jamal.
Saeed al-Jamal, who's he?
OFAC describes him as an alleged Iran-backed financier for the Houthi militia in Yemen. The accusation is Brar worked with al-Jamal's network on sanctions evasion tactics.
Like how?
Specifically, using smaller vessels more often to make the Iranian oil smuggling harder to spot.
Ah, the smaller vessels again. Why is that tactic so important?
Well, those smaller handy-sized tankers, they blend in more easily with regional traffic, especially near coasts or in places like the Persian Gulf or Coral Zubair in Iraq. They don't scream massive illicit oil shipment like a huge supertanker might.
So less conspicuous, like using lots of small boats instead of one big one.
Kinda, yeah. OFAC specifically pointed to this use of smaller vessels in the Persian Gulf and near Iraq as a key way they tried to obscure the smuggling.
Okay. What else is in the allegations?
Also, the blending and document falsification we talked about earlier. They accused Brar's network of doing this systematically to hide the oil's origin so it could be sold internationally.
And presumably Brar himself was profiting.
That's strongly suggested. Transporting sanctioned Iranian oil, which is likely sold at a discount, could be very profitable even with the risks. And one more point OFAC made. Many of Brar's vessels frequently called at Indian oil and gas terminals.
Okay.
And these terminals happen to be near the branches of his Indian company, BMP Solutions, which, raises questions about where that oil might have ultimately ended up.
Right. The Treasury seems to have laid out quite a detailed case. Did they give specific examples?
They did. They mentioned the Nadiwaya, operated by Glory International, allegedly smuggling Iranian oil for the Iranian military back in 2023.
The military effort.
And in 2024, they pointed to contracts worth millions, where NIOC hired Glory International ships, the Global Beauty and Global Eagle, for bunkering services, basically refueling other ships inside Iranian waters.
And NIOC itself is sanctioned? Right?
Yes, NIOC was designated by OFAC back in 2020 for supporting the IRGC Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard's foreign operations arm. So just doing business with NIOC is a red flag under U.S. sanctions.
Got it. So any dealing with them is risky.
Hugely risky. Another example from mid-2023 involved front companies for Iran's Ministry of Defense, Madafel. Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics. These front companies, Sahara Thunder and Asia Marine Crown Agency, allegedly coordinated an STS transfer, over 10,000 tons of Iranian oil.
From where to where?
From the Dune, owned by NITC, the National Iranian Tanker Company, to the Global Elegance, which is owned by Prime Tankers and run by Glory International.
So connecting Brar's network directly to Iran's defense ministry and state tanker company.
And importantly, Motivell was designated in 2019. NITC is also designated for supporting the IRGC-QF, and those front companies, Sahara Thunder and Asia Marine, were designated just recently in 2024 for supporting Motivell. It's a complex web.
Definitely sounds like it. A tangled web of sanctioned groups, front companies, ships. What was the last example OFAC gave?
That involved 3 prime tankers ships: Global Emerald, Global Peak, and Global Star. Between February and November 2022, they apparently loaded over 25,000 tons of petroleum products in Bandar Abbas, Iran.
Okay, destination?
Stated destinations were Oman and the UAE. But OFAC says these same ships also traveled from Iran to Khor al-Zubair in Iraq.
And the suspicion is?
That they blended the Iranian product with Iraqi products there, then, crucially, exported that blended oil possibly to the UAE with fake documents claiming it was all Iraqi origin.
Laundering the oil's identity again, selling sanctioned Iranian oil as legitimate Iraqi oil.
Precisely. Potentially capturing a higher price for it, too.
That's a lot of specific detail. And OFAC actually named the ships involved, didn't they? Put them on a blocked list.
Yes, they listed a whole bunch of vessels as blocked property because Brar, or his company's Glory International Global Tankers, prime tankers, have an interest in them. It's quite a list. Ships flagged in Barbados, Palau, Panama.
Like the Global Maharani Harmony Global Falcon.
Yeah, Global Rani, Global Emerald, Global Everest, Global Star, Global Peak, several more under Panama flags. The Global Elegance, formerly Cook Islands flag.
Okay.
Then others linked specifically to Glory International, like Global Dominance, Mirage, Global Eagle, a couple under Gambia's flag, Chilo 1, Perna. More Panama ones.
It just keeps going.
Global tankers had Global Asphalt and Simran, both Panama and Global Genesis. Prime tankers had Luanda, 1 under Panama. It really shows the scale of the network they're alleging he controlled.
So what happens now? What do these sanctions actually do to Brar and these companies?
Well, the immediate effect is pretty drastic. Any property or interest in property they have in the U.S. or that's held by a U.S. person is blocked. Frozen, basically.
Can't be cut.
Not without specific permission from OFAC. And it goes further. Any company that's owned 50% or more by these blocked individuals or entities, that company's automatically blocked too.
The ripple effect. And what about other people, other companies dealing with them now?
Big problems there too. U.S. sanctions generally ban any transactions by U.S. persons or transactions that happen within the U.S. involving the property of these designated folks, unless there's a license from OFAC or some specific exemption.
And if someone ignores that?
They face serious penalties. Big civil fines, potentially criminal charges. And that applies to non-U.S. people and companies, too, if they cause a violation involving the U.S. system. OFAC can even impose penalties without proving intent. Just showing a violation occurred is enough sometimes. Strict liability.
So it effectively cuts them off from the U.S. financial system and makes it very risky for anyone else globally to deal with them.
That's the goal, yes. Make it toxic to do business with them.
And this seems like part of a bigger picture, doesn't it? We've heard about the U.S. pressuring the UAE about firms helping Russia evade sanctions, too.
That's definitely happening. The U.S. and its allies have been talking to the UAE quite a bit, pushing them to clamp down on companies facilitating evasion of sanctions related to the war in Ukraine.
Concern that the UAE is becoming a hub for that.
There is that concern, yeah, that it might be a transit point for sanctioned goods going to Russia. So this action against Brar fits into that broader context of trying to close down these sanctions evasion routes wherever they lead.
Right.
And it's worth remembering, like some sources noted, this isn't the first time Indian companies have faced U.S. sanctions for moving sanctioned energy, whether from Iran or Venezuela previously. So the U.S. has been watching this kind of activity for a while.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what's the main thing listeners should take away about Iran, its oil, and this U.S. crackdown?
I think the key thing is just how incredibly complex and, frankly, how adaptable these evasion methods are. The whole shadow fleet concept with all its different tricks, it just highlights the lengths sanctioned countries will go to.
The ingenuity involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, you see the U.S., through actions like this one against Brar's network, being equally persistent in trying to track and disrupt these operations. It really throws the complexities of global trade and geopolitics into sharp relief. Economic pressure meets determined countermeasures.
It really does feel like a constant high-stakes game of cat and mouse playing out across the oceans, which leads to maybe a final thought for everyone listening. In a world this connected, how effective can sanctions from just one country or even a group of countries really be in the long run? And what are the wider ripple effects, maybe unintended ones, of this ongoing chase in international trade and, global security? It makes you think about that balance, doesn't it, between trying to enforce rules and the sheer resourcefulness people use to get around them. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.